this. Are we in the main session?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Welcome everyone to the session, which is very nice after David Otter's presentation on automation and ICT. And I would just like to remind everyone to keep their microphones muted. I believe this session is going to be recorded. And I would like to remind you to please put your questions in the chat. I will be moderating them after each speaker. The presentations will be about 7 to 8 minutes with a couple of minutes for questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for any remaining questions. The next break will be used for setting up the next session. Okay, so let us go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Niharika Singh, who's going to be speaking to us about hiring frictions in small firms. Go ahead, and he will be talking also about the impact of robots on Latin America, evidence from local labor markets. Andrés, go ahead.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
let you know when 2 minutes are up.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I want to convey a special thanks to the organizing institutions for the invitation and congratulations for this great conference. This is a joint paper with my colleagues at the Center for Distributive Labor and Social Studies, CEDLAS, who are Irene Brambilla, Guillermo Falcone, and Leonardo Gasparini. In this paper, we study the effect of robot adoption on labor markets for the three largest economies in Latin America during 2004 and 2016. These three countries are also the three major robot adopters in the region. See, for instance, this is the data from the International Federation of Robotics that Maurice just talked about. And there is a big jump in robot adoption in the last 15 years in the region. Although these countries lag far behind developed nations, the trends are considerable, the increasing trends. And we combine data from the IFR and household surveys that are standardized following the CEDLAC procedures, which is a joint program with the World Bank. We count on 91 districts, which is the level of representativeness in each household surveys. For instance, in Argentina, they are urban agglomerates, and in Brazil and Mexico, these are states. We have 21 industries from the international the IFR data, and well, 13 years. Districts were differentially exposed to robotization according to their initial distribution of local employment across industries. So industries such as automotive, plastic and rubbers, metals and industrial machinery had rates of robot adoption well above the average, making local labor markets with a higher concentration of employment in these industries more exposed to robotization. So we will be looking at the outcomes of interests such as employment and employment informality rates, labor incomes and wages, and welfare indicators such as poverty and inequality. We're also interested in studying heterogeneities by educational level and gender. What we find is that more exposed districts exhibit a lower relative progress in most of these outcomes. During the period of study, in the three countries, on average, the districts exhibit a strong decline in poverty and inequality, and also an increase in labor incomes, which were stronger for Argentina and Brazil than Mexico. And these industrial robots can perform very specific tasks in industrial automation applications, such as welding, painting, assembling, packaging, and labeling. Our empirical strategy is very simple. We perform district-level regression, exploiting variability across districts and time. So as I just said, our outcome variables are labor markets and welfare indicators, and our measure of robot penetration is a weighted average of robots per 1,000 workers. Weights are the share of each industry K in total local employment in a pre-shock year. We use years in the 90s. given that this robot penetration is endogenous, because firm decisions to invest in robots may depend on local conditions related to labor market outcomes, we instrument this variable with robot penetration in the United States. So our idea is that given the technological advantage of the United States over Latin America, robot adoption in US captures exogenous supply shifters related to advances in technology, availability, and prices. So we will be assuming that the evolution of robots in United States is not driven by shocks in Latin America, and that unobserved shocks in Latin America do not affect labor markets through a similar combination of exposure share than robot penetration. We see in this simple figure that there is a high correlation in robot adoption at the industry level between Latin America, these three countries, and the United States. There is a lot of heterogeneity in the evolution of robot penetration across districts in the three countries, and our first stage shows that the instrument has strong predictive power and satisfied by large the weak I/B test of excluded instruments. So what we find is that districts more exposed to robotization exhibit a relative increase in the unemployment rates, a 0.1 increase in robot penetration ratio, which is close to the average increase in our sample, causes an increase in unemployment of 0.3 percentage points. We also find that this district exhibit a relative increase in informality that is about 3 to 4 times larger in magnitude compared to the estimated coefficient with the unemployment rate, which is in line with recent evidence suggesting that the informal sector may act as a buffer to absorb part of the displaced workers, especially in Latin America and in other developing countries. We also find that these regions exhibit a lower relative increase in the average labor income. The effect is now also negative for the average wage, but not statistically significant. We also find a very strong and robust effect on poverty. So these districts also exhibit a lower relative decline in these monetary poverty indicators and a lower relative increase in different measures of inequality, although it is more imprecisely estimated. We find that employment...
There's about 2 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, don't worry. We find that the increase in unemployment concentrated on workers with medium skills, that are those with secondary complete, which can be in line with, might be in line with the task-based approach by David Autor and co-authors. There are other small findings there, that's the most important for me. And we also find that these regions exhibit a relative increase in unemployment that concentrates on males, which makes sense given that those robots were mostly adopted in manufacturing production, which exhibits a higher concentration of males, which also depict a relative increase, a relative lower increase in average incomes. So to conclude, we present evidence of the effects of robot adoption on local labor markets for the three largest Latin American economies, which were also the three major robot adopters in the regions. Although these countries lag far behind developed nations in robotization, the adoption grew considerably in recent years. We find that districts more exposed to robotization exhibit a minor relative improvement in labor market and welfare indicators compared to less exposed locations. Unemployment costs concentrated in the middle of the skill distribution and men. And we speculate that in the absence of a large informal sector that is able to absorb part of the displaced workers, the impact of robots and technological change on unemployment would be much larger. We are not claiming that it's optimal to have an informal sector, of course, because it delivers a lot of costs and inefficiencies, but given the structure of labor markets in Latin America, this sector may act as a buffer. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Andrés. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I was curious, especially, I'll go ahead and ask one to maybe get a conversation going. I was wondering if in your paper, it's very interesting after also seeing Maurice's, but in your paper, are you able to look at trade, the trade channel? Because if I understood correctly, you're looking at the penetration of robots in the 3 countries. So I was wondering if you controlled for whether the sector that you're looking at or where people work is exposed to export or import shocks for that.
Great question, Diana. Thank you. That's in the agenda. I'm working with the trade data, and I'm about to address that potential concern. But you are absolutely right.
Okay, great. So now there are some questions in the chat. I'll read them out to you. Can you tell if it's self-employment or wage employment in the informal sector?
Yes, we are looking at informality is defined as wage employees that are not contributing to any pension fund, and we did not separate self-employment from, or yes, we made some exercise, but there was no clear pattern, so we preferred not to present those results in the paper.
Okay, thank you. And another question is a suggestion, really. As an instrument, consider using robot intensity average in Western Europe or in the OECD minus the US, because the US is lagging behind in automation relative to Europe and Japan.
Great
So that could be
suggestion,
endogenous
Piotr.
to trade.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will do that for sure. Thank you.
Okay, I will find out how to copy these and get them to you.
Thank you, Diana.
Okay, you're welcome. Well, thank you very much to everyone, and we can continue. Our next presenter is Akin Cilekoglu from the University of Barcelona, talking about the impact of robot adoption on global sourcing. So go ahead, Akin, and I will remind you when 2 minutes are when you've passed the 6-minute mark.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm a PhD student at the University of Barcelona. And so this is joint work with my advisors, PhD advisors, Rosna Mora and Ramos. So the world economy has experienced a rapid expansion of production fragmentation during the last decades, and this was largely facilitated by technological developments. On the one hand, many firms in developed countries shifted some of their production processes to low-income countries, which allowed them to reduce labor costs, and they formed the global value chains across the world. And in this way, they've been sourcing intermediate inputs across distinct locations within and across national borders. On the other hand, we've also seen a dramatic increase in the use of industrial robots, which are typically considered as labor-saving technologies. And recent studies document that they've been substituting workers, mostly performing low-skill tasks. Here the research question is that can these robots make workers in developing countries redundant by substituting them? Instead of sourcing these intermediate inputs from elsewhere, from other suppliers, actually firms can prefer to produce these intermediate inputs themselves using these robots. So this raised concerns over the potential disruptions in global value chains and the possibility of reshoring activities of firms originally located in developed countries. So we use firm-level panel data from Spain, the ESE dataset. It provides us the information on sourcing strategies of firms, whether they're involved in outsourcing or whether they are vertically integrated with their suppliers. And we also know that whether these suppliers are located in a foreign country or in Spain. We combine this data set with IFR, International Federation of Robotics database, that provides us the data on industry level robot installations and the stock of robots across countries. So we start our analysis by comparing the two groups, robot adopters and non-adopters, and we observe that actually larger fraction of robot adopters involved in sourcing activities. They are also more intensely sourcing on average, and they have actually, on average, they have larger labor productivity as well as in terms of sales. So from this point on, actually, if firms have higher sales, actually we would expect them to also purchase more intermediate inputs if they don't change their sourcing strategy. So here the graphs show these relationships for each sourcing strategy. We can see that as the sales actually increase, we also observe an increase in the sourcing activities. So we implement an instrumental variable strategy. We follow an approach used by previous influential papers, and in construction of our instrument, we use industry-level annual robot installations from Germany, France, Italy, and England, and our dependent variable, endogenous variable here is binary robot adoption, and we include also initial sales of the firm, log sales in log terms. So in order to exploit the firm level variation in adoption decisions, we also interact this instrument with the dependency on foreign technologies proxied by imported technologies. There are payments for licenses and technical aids from abroad. And at this second stage, we have our dependent variable as intermediate purchases in IHS transformed values for each sourcing strategy, and we include several controls. One of them is this delta B, that is the change in the number of international markets that the firm is trading with. And theta is the dummy for intermediate purchases from internet, and we also include lagged sourcing status of the firm. And we also have time and industry dummies. So here's our baseline results that we see a large increase for each sourcing strategy, but the effects vary across sourcing strategies, and all of them are significant, and actually our results only slightly change when we use this alternative instrument. So we further include the lagged sourcing status, and then our coefficients drop, but they remain significant, and the wage actually doesn't appear to be changing the sourcing activities much. So these results are robust to use of imports from other geographical locations, since we don't know about the specific countries of these suppliers. We also use an alternative instrument that we construct from the robot installations from Scandinavian countries, and our results actually do not change. We also found an increase in production fragmentation by 27%, and also these increase in sourcing activities seem to be related to quality upgrading of firms, proxied by skilled workers and R&D employment. So we finally look at the marginal treatment effects, the heterogeneous responses to robot adoption, and with the high adoption probability that we move to the left on the x-axis in each panel, that we see that outsourcing firms that are located in the upper panel, outsourcing firms actually intensifies their sourcing activities, that the curve actually remains above the average treatment effects that is represented by this dashed line. But in contrast, for vertically integrated firms, actually with high adoption probability, we see an ease in sourcing activities. So the intensity actually falls as it remains below the average treatment effects. So to sum, we found that robot adoption increased the sourcing activities of Spanish manufacturing firms between 2006 and 16. The highest impact has been on foreign outsourcing, and lowest impact has been on foreign vertical integration. We also found an increase in production fragmentation as well as quality upgrading. Some of our findings are related to quality upgrading, and high adoption probability actually induced an increase in intensity of sourcing among outsourcing firms, but induced a reduction in intensity of sourcing among vertically integrated firms. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I did not have to say 2 minutes were up. I could see that you were well on time. Thank you very much, Akin. I don't see any questions. There are some questions in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, I do see one question. So this someone congratulates you for very innovative work. Can I ask if there is any rationale for selecting the 4 EU countries for the installation, leaving out other countries that are also well known for integrating robots in their operations?
Yeah, we chose them because they have more or less similar macroeconomic structure with Spain, at least the closest ones that we could find, and also they're in the same European Union system, so that they perhaps the effects through trade, for instance, are similar, so that we want to abstract from these kind of effects.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll remind you to keep adding questions to the chat. We will probably have a couple of minutes at the end, and if you could say who you're addressing your question to, that would be very useful. Thank you. Oh, there's another question. I'll go ahead and ask. Does robotization impacted backward and forward linkages in the case of GVC?
Well, okay, so actually, what we observe is only these intermediate purchases from these suppliers. That's and we only have these variables that we know the relationship between suppliers and sourcing firms, but we have no other actually observation on participation in global value chains.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our next presenter is Piotr Lewandowski from IBS, Institute for Structural Research, who will be speaking about the impact of robots on labor market transitions in Europe. Are you there, Piotr?
Yes, sure.
I saw you earlier. Okay, so I'll let you know when 2 minutes are up. Is that all right?
Of course.
Okay.
Let me just go full screen and start my timer just in case. All right, hello everyone. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about our study of the impact of robots on labor market transitions in Europe. It's very nice to speak after David Autor's keynote and after some related presentations, because you will be already familiar with a setting that we use. Let me start with the motivation for our study. So there is a growing body of evidence on the aggregate employment effects of automation and industrial robots. These results so far are kind of mixed. They show negative aggregate employment effects of robot adoption in the US, but they also show more or less neutral effects in Germany, on some moderate positive effects of general automation and digital technologies across Europe. And also there is an interesting paper by Feitz and De Vries, who speaks in the next session, and his colleagues who showed that there might be some negative effects of automation on robots in the OECD countries, but in the low and middle income countries, there is no evidence for this aggregate substitution of labor with automation. But at the same time, the channels behind these adjustments are under-researched. And in particular, there are basically no studies that would look at labor market transitions and try to disentangle whether these aggregate effects are driven rather by people who may lose jobs, so job separations, or by changes in job finding probabilities. And this is the research questions that we want to answer in our paper. And on this first figure, I basically show you the aggregate, the country level correlations between changes in between the robot exposure growth rate in European countries in the last 20 years, and in the changes in the probability of losing job and job finding. As you can see, there is actually a positive correlation between automation and changes in job finding probabilities. So in this paper, we use the worker level repeated cross-section data for 16 countries between 1998 and 2018. These are 16 countries. That's essentially because of data availability. We study annual labor market flows, so year-to-year flows between employment and unemployment. And we focus on measuring robot exposure at the sector occupation level using the IFR, International Federation Robotic data, that was also used by in previous presentations. And our method is the IV estimation of probability models using the control function approach. We instrument the robot exposure with the average robot exposure in a given sector in Western European countries other than the country study. So it's a little bit more general than the instrument used in the previous paper, because we basically take average across a bunch of countries, but always omitting the one that the instrument is applied to. And importantly, we also account for cross-country heterogeneity in potential effects of automation based on the initial labor cost productivity in a country. We control for labor costs in 2004. Even though we studied the European countries, there was a huge heterogeneity in labor costs and in wages. Let's say that in the poorest countries like Poland and Slovakia, the unit labor costs were about 1/3 of the unit labor costs in the most advanced countries. So it's a pretty standard IV setup. And our results are basically as follows. We do find that in European countries across over the last 20 years, robot exposure was actually leading to was reducing the probabilities of job separations, so it was increasing job stability, and was also increasing the probability, the likelihood of job finding, although not in all countries. You can see the heterogeneity of these effects across European countries. And most importantly, we find that this negative effect on job separation, so higher job stability, that this effect was much larger in the poorest countries in Europe, was much weaker in the most developed countries. And for the job findings, we also find that the likelihood of job finding was much more influenced in the less developed European countries than in those that are the richest. But behind these aggregate effects, there are also heterogeneities between different groups of workers. In the paper, we focus on three types of subpopulation. First, different occupation based on occupational tasks. So we distinguish between routine cognitive, non-routine cognitive, routine manual, and non-routine manual. We also focus on differences based on age, on gender, but for the interest of time, I will just show the task here. And we find that for the non-routine manual workers, which we would expect are kind of complementary to the automation, because the non-routine manual work is not that easy to automate. We actually do find that there is some complementarity, and the demand for this non-routine manual work has probably increased thanks to automation in these least developed European countries. We also find some evidence that people in routine cognitive jobs were affected by the automation. In particular, that the probabilities of finding a job for people in routine cognitive jobs, which might be sort of more of a support jobs, even in manufacturing, that the probabilities of finding a job among these routine cognitive workers have improved as the robot exposure has increased over time, especially in these less developed countries. So knowing what are the effects on particular flows, in particular that the robots have pushed down the likelihood of job separation and increased the probability of job finding, we can basically utilize these estimated flow probabilities to calculate what is the effect of employment and unemployment level, which results from this contribution of automation to labor market flows. So assuming
about a minute and a half.
Yes,
Sorry.
thank you. So assuming that, so here we assume that, so we perform this kind of counterfactual historical decomposition when we assume that the robot adoption since 2004 has basically that the robot exposure has remained. What would happen if the robot exposure remained at the level recorded in 2004, and this way we estimate that the actual increase in robot exposure in Europe has pushed up employment in most countries by a moderate amount, 1% of working age population up to 2% in some countries, and has compressed unemployment by the equivalent amount. And the final slide of the results that I want to show you here is that similarly to the labor market transitions literature, we calculate the contribution of job separations and job finding channels to this aggregate effect of robot exposure on employment and unemployment. And we find that the job separation channel contributes a vast majority of this effect. It has a dominant role. So on average, about 75% of the effect of automation can be attributed to job separations, which means that the higher job stability, lower probabilities of losing a job were driving up these positive effects on employment. And interestingly, we also study how these effects differ between countries with different labor market institutions. And we find that the contribution of these job separations were larger in countries that are more unionized and that have lower, less strict employment protection legislation. Okay, so just to summarize, we find that that the effects of automation on labor market flows in Europe are significant, are stronger in less developed European countries. We find that there is some complementarity between automation and non-routine manual jobs and routine cognitive jobs. We also find that there is heterogeneity. The effects were more positive for female workers. And importantly, we find some evidence that these cross-country differences can be attributed to labor market institutions, in particular higher union coverage in some countries, differences in union coverage and employment protection legislation. All right, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but it looks like we will have some minutes after the next presentation. So we'll be looking for those questions in the chat. Great, then without delaying, let me present the next speaker, who is Carol Newman from Trinity College, Dublin. And Carol, if you're there, I'll let you know when there's 2 minutes left. And we'll see, hopefully we'll get more questions in the chat to share at the end. Go ahead, Carol.
Excellent, thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So the paper I'm presenting today is something very different, I think, than the other papers that have come before me in this session. So there are no robots. But what I'm going to present to you today is some results from an experiment on conscientiousness and labour market returns based in Senegal. My co-authors are Martina Kirkberger and Vincent Thorne, also from Trinity College Dublin, where I am based, and Sveta Mulisheva from the World Bank, who I think is in the audience today. And then two psychologists on this paper, in fact, Matthias Alamond and Brent Roberts from Zurich and University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So there is a large body of evidence that highlights a link between the big 5 personality traits, and that's agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness. And the evidence has linked these to labour market outcomes, such as income, job stability, and job performance. And one of the particular aspects of their trait within the big 5, that is conscientiousness, has been particularly linked with successful labour market outcomes. You can see links with job performance, with productivity. But it's long been thought in the psychology literature that the big 5 personality traits can't be changed, that they're stable in adulthood and that they're ingrained from childhood. But recent theories in psychology are questioning this belief. And recent evidence suggests that through mindfulness or behavioral change techniques, that these personality traits can be activated in different ways throughout adulthood. But empirical evidence on this is very scarce, particularly in contexts such as the one that we are working in. So our research question is, can conscientiousness training improve labour market outcomes for low-skilled workers? So we conduct a randomized control trial using a sample of low-skilled workers who are working with a firm, a multinational firm, in the construction of an express railway in Dakar in Senegal. And we randomly assign half of these workers to a treatment group. And our treatment, our intervention, is based on the sociogenomic trait intervention model, which was developed by one of our co-authors, which is essentially a behavioral activation intervention. And it's focused on conscientiousness and is based on the idea that to change conscientiousness, it's necessary to change the relative states associated with conscientiousness. It targets the 4 facets of industriousness, punctuality, responsibility, and orderliness. And it focuses on not only on providing information, but also providing motivation to activate these traits in daily life, and reminders about activating these traits in the workplace. So in essence, what this amounted to in our intervention was a 2-hour in-person session on how to be more conscientious at work. And this was followed up by weekly short phone calls over an 8-week period to workers, reminding them of the different ways to behave more conscientiously. And these reminders were linked to the four traits: industriousness, punctuality, responsibility, and orderliness. And it was kind of involved things like, don't forget to go to meetings, don't be late for work, and so on and so forth. That's what the intervention was. So before jumping into the analysis, just to speak a little bit about where we're contributing in the literature. So first, we're contributing to the debate on whether non-cognitive skills can be actually changed in adulthood. So the literature to date on this has largely been based on in high income settings, in controlled environments. So what we're looking at is whether conscientiousness can be changed in this context of low skilled workers in a low income country. And at the same time, this allows us to see whether or not psychological interventions of this kind, which have been kind of developed with different populations in mind, whether they're actually reliable in this type of setting. Secondly, we're contributing to the literature on the effectiveness of worker training programs. We know that there's a large literature in developing countries on this topic. The evidence in general on their effectiveness is quite mixed, but a lot of recent evidence is pointing to the importance of soft skills or non-cognitive skills and their importance in the workplace. By isolating conscientiousness, we believe that this is one of the more important of the big 5 traits, or the non-cognitive skills, for low-skilled individuals in particular. A lot of these people are doing jobs that require little formal skills, but require a high level of conscientiousness. So take, for example, in our setting, we have security workers who are guarding barriers. So they have to be conscientious about letting people into the site and off the site, about wearing their protective equipment, etc. And thirdly, we contribute to the more recent literature that has highlighted the very high job turnover for low earnings individuals in low income countries. So our evidence is suggesting that improving conscientiousness might play an important role in increasing job tenure. So in terms of the setting, as I've mentioned, it's we're working with a construction company in Dakar in Senegal. We have a sample of 386 workers, all low-skilled workers, mostly working on the barriers as security guards. The first phase of the construction, it began in 2017, and you see our timeline there. We did our baseline in 2019. We had our intervention running from August to October 2019, with a midline in 2020, January, and our end line was May 2020. Now, obviously, between January and May, COVID spread in this area, so we do kind of look into that a little bit later on in our results too. So the very basic specification is just a simple regression of our outcomes at end line, regressed on the treatment with a bunch of controls, covariates, your typical covariates about the individual and the household. And the main labour market outcomes that we're interested in is, first of all, whether the person is employed. Secondly, whether they're still employed at that particular company. And then we have earnings. So the earnings is based on their earnings over the last month. So we don't find any impact on whether or not any difference in the treatment group in terms of whether they're employed, but we do find a significant effect on whether they're still at the company. So they're more likely to have retained their job at the company, suggesting that this training is impacting on their job tenure. We also find positive effects on earnings, and this is measured in terms of CFS. So the column 4 there, which has all of the controls in there, would suggest that the treated workers are earning about $41 more per month than the control workers. And this is relative to average income of $204. So it's quite a big effect. Now, you could say that that's because they still have their job at the company. So even controlling for whether or not they still have their job at the company, they still earn a significantly higher amount. So those who left the company and were treated are also earning higher wages, and that's equivalent to about $29 US. So that's the core result. So next thing we want to do is think about the mechanism. So what our intervention hoped to do was to affect conscientiousness. And in order to measure conscientiousness, we used a 32-item questionnaire where respondents were asked how easy or difficult it was to behave in a particular way on a 5-point scale. This is a standard
about
question.
2 minutes.
Perfect, thank you. That's a standard questionnaire that is used in settings, in developed country settings. Overall, for the scale, we found that the reliability measures were quite low. We also find that candidates or respondents tended to report quite high levels on that scale to begin with. So we're kind of a bit worried, if you like, about the actual measures that we managed to get from this survey. Now, we do find some evidence on 4 of the 32 measures relating to the goals and the responsibilities and the duties. So we do find some suggestive evidence that the intervention is working through this conscientiousness. But what the bigger takeaway that we have from this measure is that it's difficult to measure these things in these settings, and it's not necessarily the case that our measure that we have used is the most appropriate one. We rule out some alternative mechanisms that the intervention affected other traits, so traits other than conscientiousness, and also the potential mechanism that the company kept track and simply rewarded the trained workers. There are a couple of limitations to highlight. Obviously, COVID happened in the middle between our midline and our end line. So we did gather information on behaviours relating to COVID, about the impact of COVID, and we don't find any evidence that this interacted with our treatment, which gives us some confidence that our outcomes that we're seeing are not COVID related. We also have some concerns over the lack of an active control group, but the control group did receive some general security training similar to the one that we had, but they did not receive the follow-up phone calls. So to conclude, we're finding in this study that providing the conscientiousness training has affected job tenure and earnings. And we do believe that this is an important context to look at this type of training, these types of soft skills, because of the problem of job turnover in these settings, particularly among low-skill applications. And I think it does highlight the potential for psychological training of this kind to improve labour market outcomes for low-skilled workers. But also we would highlight that it presented some challenges in terms of using these types of standard self-reported measures to capture personality traits. And I think future research is certainly needed on appropriate instruments to use in these settings, particularly outside of controlled environments, such as university campuses. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Right now, I don't see questions on the chat, but I'll ask one myself. I wanted to ask if, and I'm sorry if you said this, there was a moment when one of my children came in, but I wanted to ask if you found evidence that the training did affect, I don't know if you had a baseline measure of conscientiousness and whether you could detect with your field work, whether that changed with the training.
So we do have a baseline measure and a midline measure of the conscientiousness, and we found a positive impact on 4 of the 32 items that we included. On the other items, for the most part, they move in the direction you would expect, but we don't see any statistical significance. And one of the reasons for that is that in responding to the questionnaire, most people responded in a very positive way. So there's not a whole lot of variation at baseline on these measures, which makes us think about, I think that the type of questionnaire that you use in this setting is potentially should be a bit different than what you would use in a university campus in Zurich, for example. So there are lots of cultural things that you might think about. There could have been translation issues. There's a lot of different things that could. So one of our takeaways from the paper, in fact, is that we need to improve this type of measurement in this setting. But I would say we're confident enough that we have suggestive evidence that the training did impact on the conscientiousness.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Piotr had also asked the same question on the chat, so thank you. And actually, Piotr, if you're still there, there was a question for your talk, and we have a couple of minutes before the session ends. If anyone has a question for Carol, we might have a few minutes if you want to add the question, but there was a question for you that asks about what do you think would be the likely impact of robots on employment if your study had been extended to the PWDs? So I don't know if you would like to jump in to answer that.
If it was extended to what, excuse me?
It says PWDs. I don't know what that is either.
I may struggle with that as well. Can the person who asked the question elaborate in the chat?
People with disabilities.
Oh, that's I don't know really. We might have this hasn't really been, people with disabilities haven't really been at the focus of all these sort of like robot automation studies. It appears to me that they barely perform these sort of like factory floor jobs, which are which are most likely to be affected. So we haven't really looked into heterogeneity based on the disability status or basically any other health status. I'm afraid we don't really have such information in the labor force survey data in Europe. So I'd rather not speculate what could be the impact. I haven't really thought about that. I will, thank you.
Okay, thank you. My impression just is that labor survey data probably is not representative. It's probably an underrepresented group, but it's a good question to ask, to keep in mind, since a lot of the discussion during this conference has been about changing the way we measure certain things in surveys. So thank you. There's another question for you, since you're on the screen. Are the results in your work largely driven by the high shares of routine jobs in less developed countries, or are there other important differences across countries? And are you able to differentiate between different types of technologies, complementary or labor substitutable?
Yeah, thank you. So we do focus on automation technologies, on industrial robots. Actually, we do control for all other types of investment, but the technology of interest is our automation technology. So in principle, they should substitute labor, but actually, sort of like our paper contributes to the growing body of evidence for Europe that it's not really happening. So automation doesn't appear to have net negative effect on unemployment in Europe, and the fact that we find a more positive effect, like more of a like a neutral effect in the richest countries and a positive effect in the poorer countries. I think one of the reasons might be that a key driver of automation in these poorer European countries are like greenfield investments, which differs from the US, where you basically substitute capital with a newer capital in existing plants, but you don't really expand the size of the sector. I think that in many European countries, it's about expanding the sectors when you automate. So that might be the reason why the substitution, even though it should be at a level of a human versus machine performing task, is not really seen at the more aggregate level.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, and we are 3 minutes shy of the hour, so I think we could conclude the session. Oh, sorry, there's another one. This question is for Carol. Great. Carol, do you think it would be important to extend your study to understand how conscientious training is complemented by other factors such as work conditions?
Yeah, I think that is a very good idea. So, you know, what you could think about there is, I mean, if is conscientiousness, is the worker conditions, is a condition on worker conditions that, you know, conscientiousness actually improves this type of behavior. So the one thing I would say that in our study, we're working with one construction company. So there's no heterogeneity in the working conditions of the sample in the treatment and the control group. But I do see that as an important question moving forward, because a lot of these low-skill jobs, particularly in the construction sector, are not necessarily the best jobs in terms of working conditions. So I think that that's a good suggestion and worth looking into. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this will be the end of our session, just right on time. Just a few announcements. We're going to have a 15-minute break now that can be used to set up the next session for if there's any presenters here from the next session. Our next session will be, I believe, the last session of the conference. It will start at 15 minutes after the hour, wherever we all are in the world. And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.